I'm Andrew Barth Feldman, and you're listening to the Broadway Podcast Network.
Hi, it's Michael Urie, and you're listening to the Broadway Podcast Network.
Hi, this is Leslie Margarita, and you are listening to the Broadway Podcast Network.
Hi, guys, this is Tommy Bracco, and you're listening to the Broadway Podcast Network.
Hello, I'm Rebecca Aparicio.
And I'm Sammy Canold.
And we are incredibly excited to welcome you to the kickoff event of the Comeback Project, a new conversation series hosted by the Broadway Podcast Network to help theater makers restart in the wake of the pandemic.
This series came about because of conversations Rebecca and I were having over the course of 2020. As freelance theater directors witnessing and impacted by the decimation of live theater, Rebecca and I realized we shared an obsession with looking for signs of hope for the future.
Throughout 2020, we would send each other articles on success stories from around the globe, stories of countries or theater companies that had managed to make theater safely during the pandemic and who we could learn from.
And then in June of 2020, I was fortunate to have an opportunity to travel to South Korea and then the UK for a project that allowed me to observe the inner workings of both theater industries during the pandemic. And this gave me access to conversations about best practices, protocol, and a sense of what it was like for theater makers to return to work safely during or in the wake of the pandemic.
But it occurred to us that while we could read an individual article or talk to a colleague in a trailblazing country, there was no centralized place where theater makers could go to find a collection of best practices and case studies for making theater safely and effectively in this moment or near the future. So we decided to create a platform focused on information sharing and to focus on hearing that information directly from the pioneering leaders who showed the way.
Rebecca and I don't have the answers ourselves, but what we can do is provide a platform where folks who do have the answers can share them. In today's panel, Reopening Theaters, Lessons from Countries Who've Done It, we'll focus specifically on best practices and case studies from countries in which theaters have partially or fully reopened at some point during the pandemic. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to reopening theaters, of course, and obviously, America has the highest reported number of COVID cases in the world right now, so it's natural that our industry will be opening later than those of several of our international colleagues.
But if there is an upside to be had, is that for us Americans, we can learn from those that came before us and not have to reinvent the wheel that's already been invented, which is why we're hosting this conversation today. Before I turn it over to Sammy to start our panel, I want to let you know that this is just the first of many conversations. And if you'd like to hear more conversations like this one, such as a conversation about best practices for making outdoor theater, please fill out our form in the chat and we'll put you on a mailing list where you can be notified. All right, Sammy, take it away.
Thank you. I'm now going to introduce our amazing panelists, whom we're so grateful to have joining us today. You can read their full bios on our website, which is bpn.fm/The Comeback Project. But for now, I've given myself the challenge of introducing each of them in just one sentence so that we can get to the meat of our conversation right away. Our panelists are Michael Castle. Michael is the CEO and producer of the Australia-based live entertainment company, the Michael Castle Group, whose productions include Harry Potter and the Cursed Child Australia, the international tour of The Lion King, and the upcoming premiere of Hamilton Australia, among many, many, many more. Hi, Michael. And Ginny Kim. Ginny is managing director of the South Korea-based theater agency Theater Bridge International, which works on projects that cross over between the UK and Korean theater industries, including the South Korean tour of Cats and the upcoming South Korean premiere of Hadestown. Haruka A. Nakagawa. Haruka is section chief in the International Relations Department at Japan's Shiki Theater Company, whose work includes the Japanese productions of The Lion King, Aladdin, and The Phantom of the Opera, among many more. And I want to take a moment to especially thank Haruka and Ginny for being up at what is 7 a.m. in Tokyo and Busan to join us. This conversation is taking place across 6 different time zones and 4 continents in a moment of global camaraderie. So we're very grateful to both of you, and also to our next panelist who's tuning in on what is 10 p.m. his time. Alistair Smith. Alistair is the editor of The Stage, a weekly British newspaper and website that is at the forefront of covering the entertainment industry in the UK and around the world, as well as the author of 2 major industry reports, the London Theatre Report and the Theatre Workforce Review. And completing our panel is Ariel Stolier. Ariel is the programming director of Argentina's Paseo La Plaza, a production company and leading theater center comprising of 4 main stages in Buenos Aires. And he has produced or executive produced more than 80 plays and musicals in Argentina, Chile, Mexico, Uruguay, and Brazil. Welcome, everybody. All of these panelists have been on the front lines of conversations about reopening theaters. It was important to Rebecca and I to include folks who inhabit different kinds of roles in the theater so you can hear about reopening from of perspectives. So I'm going to ask our amazing panelists a series of questions, and then before the end of our panel, we'll open it up for a bit of Q&A. So feel free to put any questions in the chat throughout our conversation. Panelists, these questions are a starting point for us, but my hope is that this will turn into something more conversational, so feel free to jump in and, of course, respond to each other. To kick us off, I want to start by asking you a State of the Union question so that our audiences can become more familiar with where your respective theater industries are at in this specific moment. So for Michael, Ariel, and Haruka, I'd love to ask you, when did your country's theaters first start reopening? What capacity are your theaters at the moment? And what productions are you currently working on? And we can start with Michael.
Thank you. Well, look, we are in the fortunate position. We started having theatres reopen at the end of November here in Australia. We've had productions of Pippin open in Sydney, the production of Frozen open in Sydney, which is currently running here at the Capitol Theatre. And then earlier this year, a lot of our resident and subsidised theatre companies started reopening, a lot of our performing arts venues reopening. Come From Away, commercial production in Melbourne, opened at the end of January. Just last week, I got to sit in the theatre for the very first time in almost 12 months as we returned Harry Potter and the Cursed Child to the stage. And that's currently playing in Melbourne now at 85% capacity. And in a few weeks' time, we launched Hamilton, which will open here in Sydney and will be playing to 100% houses. So we're in a fortunate position here. Obviously, it's a great testament to the way that the pandemic has been managed by the authorities and by government. And it's wonderful to be seeing our cast, our crew, our musicians, and indeed our audiences returning to the theatres.
It's just amazing. Ariel, can you speak to the situation in Argentina?
Yes. Thanks for inviting me first. We opened similarly to Australia in mid-November, but only for a 30% allowed capacity, which was very low. And we call it more of a testimonial season than a real season, because very few theaters were allowed to open at that time because of such low capacity and new requirements in terms of ventilation and air filtering that made it impossible for the smaller houses to afford it, so they couldn't reopen. And the scarcity of shows, because we had to plan in advance what kind of content we were able to put on stage, and it took us fairly by surprise the authorization to open with such a low capacity. By mid-January, we're allowed to increase capacity to 50%. We're currently at 50% capacity. So that, in a sense, allowed us to increase the type of shows that we're putting on stage. Currently, more than 50 shows are running in Buenos Aires. That's a large number, even though not all of them are doing 6 or 7 or 8 shows a week, maybe 1, 2, or up to 3 or 4 at the most. But it allowed us to open up the buildings again and mostly do co-productions with smaller theaters that were impossible for them to open. So we book some of their shows and musicals into the larger houses as well. And we basically are in a very peculiar situation where we are trying to, on the one hand, increase capacity, but then having a close look into the sanitary and the health situation, because we have been going through the first wave of the pandemic and we're expecting a second one when our winter in this type of region comes. And so it's basically managing the uncertainty, but the type of shows that we're producing or presenting changed into limited engagements rather than open-ended, because we have to plan in such an uncertain time.
Amazing, thank you. Haruka, can you speak to the situation in Japan?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me today. So excited, so honored. So we have gone through a couple of stages since reopening our shows in the middle of July of last year. We, first of all, shut down our shows at the end of February, and from then until the end of June, for about 4.5 months, we were closed and slowly started reopening in the middle of July. This was right after we had gone through our first state of emergency in Japan. So right after that was lifted, we were required to keep our capacity at 50% or below. And we also refunded all the tickets that had been already sold by that point, so that we could resell all of those tickets at a socially distanced new seating arrangement. So that was a whole crazy thing that we processed that we had to go through. But just to give a safer environment for our audiences, we kept the first few rows empty, and we only sold every other seat, so there were space in between our guests. That went on from, again, middle of July until November. The government started easing restrictions in the month of November. So briefly, we were back to almost full capacity. We still refrained from selling the first few rows, but we stopped doing keeping every other seat empty. So we were about 94-95% capacity, depending on the theater. So that's when we, started seeing hope of, perhaps we could, keep going in this direction. But whoops, sorry, my AirPods just fell off. But then towards the end of the year, Japan started seeing an increase in COVID numbers again. And early this year, in early January, the country declared a second state of emergency, and we're still in the midst of it. And we're hoping it will be lifted sometime soon, but we're still in the middle of it. And this time around, the government has once again asked large-scale events to keep to 5,000 people or 50%, whichever is less. So obviously, again, once again we went back to the 50% capacity, and that's where we are at right now. Although the seats this time aren't socially distanced because the state of emergency took effect. So suddenly we didn't have time to do the refund and then resell again like we did last summer. So the audiences are somewhat close. Not close together, but just in they do sit next to each other, so that's a little bit different than what we did last year. But yes, we are still limited in our capacity. But in despite of that, we've been able to fairly consistently continue our productions. Right now, Shiki alone has 8 productions running throughout Japan, 5 in Tokyo, and 3 others throughout the country. There are many, many other big productions being produced by companies other than us.
Great, thank you. And Ginny, South Korea's theaters never fully closed at the outset of the pandemic, so to ask you about reopening wouldn't make much sense, but can you talk about what capacity your theaters are at the moment and what you're working on at the moment?
So we actually went through different stages of pandemic in Korea. Like from the beginning, we were very good. But then at one point, we had one kind of like first wave of big kind of spread. Then the second wave came in September, and then the third wave came in December. So we had to kind of go through all the different stages of our social distancing level. So now we run different system now, because in Seoul, which is a capital city, it's under social distancing level 2, which means we have to socially distance 70%, and then in the regional theater it's 1.5, which is also 70%. But this has been changed recently by kind of our request to the government, because we had a different system early on. 1.5 social distancing level was 70%, and then level 2 was 50%, and then level 2.5 was almost 30%. So then we had to run in December and January over almost 3 months under level 2.5, which is 30%, which is almost, for us as a producer, unlikely to run the theater. So we kind of had to make a case to the government that, because we had some COVID confirmed cases in the venue, but then nobody got affected by it. So we had to kind of make a case to the government, look, this is the case. No one actually got COVID from these confirmed cases. So theater venue is fairly safe because everyone's wearing a mask. So you should really take that into your consideration to ease this regulation that you're having. So the government did listen to us. So now we're running a little bit of a different system, which is a bit relaxed. So 2.5 and level 2, we can run still 50% capacity. And then 1.5 and then level 2, that's 70%. Oh, sorry. 2.5 is 50%, and level 2 and the 1.5 is 70%. So that's how we run at the moment. So in Busan and Seoul, because I'm in Busan running Musical Cats, we are running 70% capacity. But then we're looking into releasing a little bit more, because I think government is going to allow a little bit more relaxed policy in near future. So we're still having that discussion, because we feel like theater is fairly safe space in terms of COVID, because everyone is wearing masks indoors. So that's what we're dealing with at the moment.
Great, thank you. And Alistair, can you give us a brief overview of the journey the UK has been on in regard to reopening theaters since the first attempt in July, and tell us about the upcoming May and June 2021 milestones for the UK?
Yes, it's been a bit of a roller coaster in the UK. Probably the easiest the way to describe it is everything shut down across the whole of the UK last March, and for Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, it has been shut ever since then, and there has been no live performance, essentially. So really, it's only been in England that there's been any live performance. We had a period of open air theatre that started in July, and then we were eventually allowed to open indoors with social distancing from August, so mid-August. That lasted through till early October, when we went into another lockdown and everything shut down again. That lockdown lasted until sort of towards the end of November, early December, when we reopened again, briefly under a rather complicated tier system in which some parts of the country were allowed to perform. This is all with social distancing, and some weren't. That then got stricter, and most people were suddenly not allowed to host live performance. So that included London. So the West End, that had been gearing up for pantomime season and Christmas shows, was shut down at sort of late notice just before Christmas. And then since January, we've all been in total lockdown. However, we found out recently that from May, we will be allowed to return to socially distanced performances. And that is with 1 metre, what we call 1 metre plus social distancing. So roughly 50% capacity, depending on the venue. And then the plan is, all being well, that those restrictions will go completely towards the end of June. And in theory, at that point, we're allowed to perform with total capacity. But I think people are taking that with a slight pinch of salt at the moment.
Thank you. It's so inspiring to hear about all the efforts, and I think that's something that in America, so many of us are wondering about is when you're allowed to open your theaters at these capacities, how has the response been? And Michael, you're on the front lines of getting audience back into buildings, which seems to me a particularly hard task on a continent where travel between states is often restricted. How are you finding consumer willingness to return to the theater? And is there anything that your theater community is doing that you think has been particularly effective in getting everyone excited to return?
Well, I think there's a great deal of confidence in the work that's been undertaken by both theatre owners, the health authorities in each state, and indeed the producers to make sure it's the most safe environment possible for audiences to return. What we've seen, certainly there's a great appetite for audiences to return to the theatre. So from a sales perspective on Hamilton, which we launched back in September at a time when certainly theatres were closed and no absolute certainty as to when they would return. There was a great outpouring of desire to be in the theatre, and we've seen that continue to build indeed on Harry Potter and the Cursed Child. Our sales, since announcing our return at the end of December, has been extremely strong. And I know that's being shared by all of the other producers and organisations here in Australia as they are putting their shows on sale. I think for Australian audiences, and I'm sure this will be the case internationally, having been at home and having a lot of this taken away from us, there's a great desire to go and engage again, go and be at one with the community, and indeed engage with these stories and connect with these artists on stage. So I'm hopeful that as shows continue to return to the stage, and indeed concert tours and other forms of entertainment continue to return, that we will continue to see audiences coming out of their homes and back into our theatres.
And you mentioned this sense of confidence because of the measures that are in place. And I'd love to talk about the measures that all of your countries, are using, but we'll divide it into two categories, talking about what's happening in the rehearsal room and then talk about what's happening front of house. And Haruka and Ginny, you both spend a significant amount of time in rehearsal rooms and interfacing with creatives. And I'm wondering if you can talk us through the measures that you're currently using in your rehearsal rooms to make sure your companies are safe. Whoever wants to go first.
I'll go first because I did the rehearsal with Sammy when Sammy was over. So we had to go through little drama when Sammy was there, because I was doing the rehearsal of Cats, so we had to kind of go through all the small details about how we should actually do the sanitary measures in the rehearsal room. So what we needed to do, we need to take everyone's temperature before they go into the building. So if they have a higher temperature than 37 Celsius, then they have to go back to their hotel or their home and then stay for 2 days and then see how the temperature kind of goes down or if someone has any symptoms, they can't really come to the rehearsal room. That's the first step that we kind of prevent this possible spread. And then the second stage is everyone has to kind of wear a mask in the rehearsal room unless they are acting or dancing. So that's everyone's kind of a first rule. So you're not allowed to take off your mask unless you're actually doing the show. So for example, like directors or musical director, they're not actually allowed to take their masks off unless it's absolutely necessary. So that's the measures that we put in place in the rehearsal room. And also we figured it's very likely to be spreaded when they're eating something. So in lunchtime, we try to kind of socially distance everyone so they don't have to be so close together. So that's what we try to do. But when we were rehearsing Cats, our social distancing level kind of all of a sudden went up. So the building that we are in was owned by the government. So the building had to shut down. So we had to kind of move to a different rehearsal room in the middle of the production, middle of rehearsing. So we had to move everyone from this building to another building. And the second challenge was we needed to find a rehearsal room which is available back then, which was very difficult. So that was a bit of a crazy drama that we had to deal with. So that's the measures that we put in place in the rehearsal room at the moment. And then in the front of house, we have this QR code system. Everyone has to kind of fill in. So we use that to enter the venue. So all the audience has to kind of fill that up and then enter the theater. And no one's allowed to take off their mask during the show. That's so the ushers will kind of go through everyone and then check if they have their masks on. And then all the information they have to fill in, it has, do you have a temperature or symptoms, or where have you been in the last couple of days and things like that. You have to kind of tick that box off, and otherwise you're not allowed to get into the venue. So then if someone, and then they also need to check their seat number, so that if someone is confirmed as a COVID cases, so people who's sitting around them, they're getting notifications from the government that you are in need of getting COVID test. So all of that measures help a lot for us to feel the theater space is very safe.
Great. Haruka, add to that?
Yeah, sure. So we at Cheeky, we have our own rehearsal facilities in the same complex as the management offices, which is great, which means we have the entire building to our leisure and like really place strict safety measures. We do similar measures that Jeannie just went over, wearing face masks, obviously, taking temperatures at the office entrance for everyone. Also, everyone in the company, including actors, office staff, and tech staff, are required to report temperature and physical conditions every single day, including days off. We have this special mobile app where you can just plug in your temperature every morning and report to the company. That's something that's become kind of a norm here in Japan. There are a lot of companies that require their employees to do that. There are antiseptics placed everywhere, literally everywhere in the building. So you disinfect your hands every 30 seconds. And once in the rehearsal room, again, as Jeannie explained, everyone is required to keep their masks on, except for the actors. Although for the actors as well, we ask them to rehearse, sing, and dance with masks on until a certain point in the rehearsal process, just to be extra careful. We do test our actors regularly. We do PCR testing approximately every month for actors actually performing in our shows. I think we test them a little bit more frequently, but for the people in the rehearsals room as well, because they do have to interact without masks, we try to test them as frequently as we can. And we also are careful about not touching the floor. We ventilate the room pretty frequently for every rehearsal, and we disinfect the floors, all kinds of things to keep everything clean and safe. We also have placed some measures in our cafeteria as well. And once again, Ginny has mentioned this already, but eating has been identified as having one of the highest risks of getting infected. That's a big thing in Japan as well. And actually, in the current state of emergency that we're going through, the government has placed especially strict restrictions on restaurants and on their operating hours, and encouraging people to stay home after 8 p.m. So that's been difficult for a lot of the people in the food industry. But in any case, in our cafeteria, we've rearranged the seats so that everyone is facing the same direction. No one can sit across from each other. And we are very, very strict about not speaking while eating. So we try not to say hello to anyone who is eating. It's kind of a rule that we've established for ourselves. What else? We
That's
have
great.
we also I'll quickly just mention that we also have a set of general company guidelines on daily activities. So company members are encouraged to not eat outside as much as possible, or eat with people outside their families, kind of thing.
Amazing.
Sami, can I add
absolutely
a comment? For us here in Argentina, both rehearsals and performances have been difficult and tricky. It's much better to be open than closed, but it's very difficult to get our people, our staff, and our artists to understand the importance of being careful. Even though we have the same protocols, or very similar protocols, we are a very social society. People were used to hug and kiss even between strangers. So we have to disengage from a whole culture of touching and sharing that was very innate to our society. So rehearsals are difficult, are boring, are very strict, and we even had to negotiate with our government to write in our protocols a line that defines what we call fleeting touching or fleeting crosses on stage that allowed us to put on stage musicals or plays. Otherwise, some scenes wouldn't be possible to restage, or some plays wouldn't be possible. So those fleeting crosses or touching are reduced to no more than 1 minute, and we are trying to be very careful to comply with that. And we're also testing everyone every other week or so. But I mean, it's not perfect, but it's better that way. It's difficult for artists usually because, for instance, they cannot go for dinner after each performance. We try to discourage them from socializing outside the venue and not sharing dressing rooms as well. So it requires for everyone to make adjustments to the way we used to work at the theater. That's for sure.
Wow, that sounds exceptionally difficult, and all the more heroic that you're continuing at it. In terms of front of house, Alistair, this July, I know you attended the trial at the London Palladium in which LW Theatres piloted health and safety protocol in the West End. Can you talk us through what that experience was like and what measures were implemented? You know, I mean, feel free to talk scientifically, but also just, you know, emotionally what it was like to be back at the theater.
I mean, a lot of the measures were quite similar to the ones that Ginny spoke about, because a lot of them were based on what obviously Lloyd Webber and the company had learned from you, Sami, in your working career. So it was, you started off with staggered entry, which is obviously a new thing. When you got your ticket, you were given a time that you should turn up at the theatre that was, I think it was up to an hour before the start of the show, and it was done in sort of bands of 20 minutes. We had, again, a QR code where you would you'd scan and then put in your track and trace information before you went into the theatre. There was a thermal temperature check on the way in. They had installed antiviral handles on all the doors. That's the only theatre I've seen those in, though. I don't think that's particularly widespread. In the auditorium, I would say about 70% of the seats had massive crosses on them, indicating that you weren't allowed to sit there, which is quite a weird experience. And they also used a kind of sort of misting, an antiviral misting kind of fog that they did every few days in the theatre to clean it out. And then everyone had to wear masks. In terms of things like bars, the bars were in operation, but you sort of ordered from your phone and it was brought to you in your seat. You were allowed to take off your mask to eat and drink, but other than that, you had to keep it on for the whole time. It was, I mean, on the one hand, it was the first time that any of us had been in the theatre since March, and that was kind of joyous. At the same time, it was depressing because it didn't really feel like theatre. And I think for the performers, it was quite tough. I think because it was, the Palladium. I don't know if anyone has been there. It's a huge house, and to have that 30% full, it feels like you're rattling around a barn. So it was wonderful and awful at the same time, to be honest. Things got better, I would say, because I went to see a number of shows after that, where the social distancing requirements were reduced, and so there were more people. And actually, I went back to the Palladium to see the Panto in December, and that was a very different experience. That was a really lovely experience. Actually, it was joyful, and I think it was probably about maybe 60% full then. But most of those measures, in fact, all of those other measures were still in force then, and I was going just as a punter rather than a person going to a pilot then. So that was what a normal audience member would have experienced as well.
Thank you, Michael. Is there anything that you'd add? That, I mean, your industry is sort of the most recent to come back in full force, that you're implementing now.
Yeah, the big focus for us, both with Pottery in production and with Hamilton in rehearsals currently, is the delineation between front of house and back of house. So we've really quarantined the company. Anybody who is in rehearsals or in the show is in bubble A, and anybody who deals front of house, our ushers, our technical staff, our production staff who are required to be in the auditorium, are in bubble B. And what we really have to ensure, and it's you have to think about it a lot because you're so used to coming from front of house to back of house, is that you can't cross over. So anybody who is in bubble A, the company bubble, we are doing testing once a week. We do that every Thursday. We get our text message of an evening to say that our tests have come back and returned a negative. But if people are in the bubble B, which is the front of house, then if I'm required to go back of house, we're required to put on full PPE gear. So that's a new mask, boots for our shoes, jackets, etc., just to preserve the quarantine environment for the company. And that's been a real focus, and obviously a real challenge in rehearsing shows because we're so used to moving freely. But I think as the rest of the colleagues have said, these layers of complexity, albeit challenging, I think everybody has adapted to those processes remarkably because it allows us to get on and get these shows up and running.
It's amazing. And Ariel, you and I have had several conversations about consumer confidence in Argentina and the public education campaign that you've been waging to get people back into the theater. And I want to show 2 videos that you sent me on the campaigns that have been particularly inspiring to me, and I think will be interesting for our audience to see. And then I'll ask you a question about that. But Brittany, could we play those videos, please? Thank you, Brittany. So Ariel, I know that the first video is from footage that was shot before the pandemic, but I'm curious if you can tell us about how these campaigns came to be in this moment, and what your strategy has been to get people excited to return to the theater.
So yeah, the first one was before the pandemic, obviously, and we try to always with our colleagues create campaigns not just for our little or big show or musical, but for the whole, for the sector as a whole, because even though we compete for audiences, we're all colleagues that collaborate in current or future productions, and any project that gets successful helps the whole industry. So the first one tried to emulate. Argentina is a very passionate country for soccer, football. So we try to emulate that passion during the day for soccer to the theater every night. So we ran it at the same time that there was the World Cup. So everyone was focusing rather in the Argentine team, but we tried to engage ourselves with the same passion and communicate that you can feel those same emotions when you go to the theater as well. Whereas the second one was the first phase of a three-phase campaign currently running in Argentina. And the first one was explaining the protocols for our audiences, which were very graphic. And we believe those messages were right for what we call the hardcore theater audiences that were already sold into going back to a theater, and we were just informing them about the way to receive them. But then we're currently going through the second and the first and the third phase of the campaign. The second one was showing the large variety of shows and all types of genres, from musicals and text-based plays and emerging artists and musical shows and stand-up comedy and shows for younger audiences as well. So showing the wealth of productions going on in Buenos Aires. And the third one, which is just started today on national television, is based on testimonials from audience members showing their emotions, expressing their happiness of going back to see a show or a musical, and being them the endorsers, but us. So in that sense, we're trying to stimulate and bring back those who are yet doubtful or unwilling or unable to go back to the theater, to listen and to identify with regular people who are experiencing theater again. So we do believe it's certainly important in this period to collaborate between colleagues, theaters, and to express the value of theater as an experience rather than just focusing on marketing our own shows. And that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you. I think it's so, and you're talking about the theater community's relationship with the government. Alistair, I know you've reported extensively on the many curveballs, thrown at the UK theater industry. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that industry's relationship with the government and what to you has been effective at getting Culture Secretary and others to understand the plight of theater artists and what your industry needs the government to do to support the industry now.
Yeah, I mean, that has been a journey as well. I would say at the beginning of all this, they really didn't have a clue at all. I mean, it was a very difficult relationship, and we had a new culture secretary who was new to his brief. We had a department that hadn't really ever had to deal with, especially the commercial sector in the UK before, and the commercial sector is a huge part of our theatre ecology. And so I think they kind of had to start from first principles and explain why this was a bigger problem for theatre than it was for other sections of the economy. And really, it was a very basic, to talk about capitalization of shows, about rehearsal periods, the fact that once the lockdown was, you couldn't just say theatres can open tomorrow and expect shows to suddenly start up again, although they did do that on a number of occasions. So it's been a bit of a bumpy ride. I would say that the position we're in now is a lot better, and there is kind of understanding on both sides. One of the big things that helped with that was that the government did give a sizable funding package to the arts and culture sector of £1.57 billion. So that covered everything. It wasn't just theatres, museums and galleries as well, but theatre got a decent slice of it, and they've just given some more money as well. So that's obviously been helpful. I think the thing that convinced them to give that money was the economic impact of theatre. I think we made lots of arguments around social benefits and educational community benefits. I think the one they listened to was the economic impact and what not having those theatres, especially in the West End, would do to the rest of the West End economy. And if you walk around London at the moment with no theatres, it is absolutely a ghost town. And there was a period when restaurants were able to open, but theatres weren't, and the restaurants and bars were all empty because there was no one there. So I think that was that message got through, the economic message. And I also think there has been, and I think this is slightly uncomfortable for the industry, the theatre sector in the UK. I think we have a government that is, we've had Brexit, has a slightly nationalistic kind of flavour to our government at the moment, and I feel like culture has benefited from that in some ways, as being seen as kind of emblematic of British soft power, and so the government has wanted to support it, and I think that's a slightly uncomfortable position for the sector, that probably the majority of which doesn't agree with those politics.
So interesting. I want to pivot to talking a little bit about curveballs that have been thrown at you in terms of COVID itself. And Haruka, you, Rebecca, and I have talked a little bit about what's happened when you've had cases within your company. And I'm wondering if you could talk about how you've dealt with it when those situations have arisen.
Yeah, sure. We have all these protocols in place, and we take so much care and responsibility to protect each other, keep each other safe. But, when it happens, it just happens, and it's just the way it is. And unfortunately, we have seen several cases in the last 7.5 months since we've reopened, where our company members, actors specifically, have tested positive for COVID while performing in shows, and we had to close performances for an extended period of time. But and actually in Japan, what seems to be the trend these days is that theater companies and producers tend to close their shows right away when someone first reports with symptoms like high fever, even before they are actually confirmed positive, and they just close the show, get that person tested, and if the result is positive, if the result is negative, then they would be able to resume the show right away. But if unfortunately positive, then they would normally have to close the show for approximately 2 weeks, so the rest of the company can get tested and recover. However, in the case of Shiki, there's something that has enabled us to continue our shows fairly consistently throughout the pandemic, and something that has saved us from actually having to close for weeks is this unique multi-casting system that we have in our theater company. And what we do is we almost always cast multiple actors for every principal role, every ensemble track. And the system we have here is unlike understudies or standbys or swings. These actors are given equal opportunities and perform in shifts. So under normal circumstances, someone would perform, a couple months in this show and then jump to another show that Shiki is producing. And it's literally just performing in shifts. And to give you an example of how that's worked to our advantage in this pandemic, in one of our productions that was running in Tokyo last fall, when someone first tested positive, everyone in the cast were naturally deemed close contact by the health authorities here and were advised to quarantine for 2 weeks. But because we had this other set of cast that was on standby for the same show, what we were able to do is to thoroughly disinfect the theater, on stage and backstage, of course, and then replace the company with a brand new cast just several days after we found the initial case, and we were able to resume the show just within a week of finding out that someone had first tested positive. So because we had that entire complete set of cast, we were able to do that, and that's kind of an extreme case where we had to switch out the entire company. But we have had other cases where, you know, 1 or 2 actors were able to be replaced immediately, and thus enabling us to continue the show. And this casting system is something we've always had, but really it's really saved us here now, and it's not something that every company in Japan does. It's kind of unique to Shiki, and under normal circumstances it can create a complicated situation because you have multiple actors basically competing for the same role. But in these times, it seems you know, the sharing of roles and sharing of responsibilities and just keeping our shows going has been really, really important.
Can I ask you a question, Haruka? Is there any insurance or government support if your shows are required to shut down? Obviously, you are major exercise to be able to swap the casts over, but is there any support if you are dark for a period of time due to a positive case?
Right at the moment, there are some subsidies that we can apply for the government, but not specifically for these individual cases where we have to close. And these actors all come from within Shiki's. They are our employees anyways, full-time. So I don't believe, I'm not too involved in that side of the business, but I don't believe that we can make a case for these individual circumstances, unfortunately.
Certainly been a discussion we've been having a lot here as an industry over the past 6 months or so, because, you know, while we have the great, you know, privilege of getting the shows up and running, the great risk is if there is a positive test in a company, then that forces the shows to close for an extended period of time. And obviously, you know, there's great risk there. And I think, as we've all found the world over, our insurance policies no longer cover this type of pandemic. So it's been a conversation that's been had at an industry level. It's certainly a conversation that's been had with government. I think a lot of shows, as we are essentially self-insuring now, you know, taking up an accrual, so that if it does happen, and hopefully it doesn't, you know, we were able to preserve the company, keep it together, and return. Hopefully that isn't something that will be in our future.
But that, in your case, Michael, that's not government supported.
No, it's not. And look, speaking of curveballs, we had a curveball a couple of weeks ago. We were in our sort of final week of rehearsals for Harry Potter and the Cursed Child in Melbourne, and the state implemented a statewide lockdown, and so we had to send our cast and crew home on a Friday afternoon. And it was, you know, the following week on the Thursday that we were able to return. So obviously, you know, that had a great impact in terms of the costs and impact in terms of the rehearsal schedule, etc. But, you know, we were still fortunate enough to have enough contingency time built into that schedule so that we could still reopen as planned. But the risk is, as we go along and we have patrons coming in and ticket buyers, if that was to be implemented again while we're in performances, the financial implications are dramatic.
Right. I want to open it up now to Q&A. I think Rebecca and Britt, if you want to hop in any questions. Okay, we have one question. Are any of the panelists requiring ticket buyers to have COVID tests? Are you requiring any of your audiences to be tested for COVID before they come to the theater?
No, I mean, I think it's a dynamic situation. It's evolving, but we have to understand that we're walking through a very fine line. We're trying to lure audiences back into the theater, but we have to give them confidence. But at the same time, we need to find a model that makes it sustainable for theaters and productions to remain open as well. So far, I think, and yet, if we are allowed such a limited capacity as 50% or less. So I believe that the industry so far, what we are requiring is an affidavit of health status each time someone buys a ticket, either remote or at the box office. But we're all learning to try out our activities again within the virus, because it's not yet eliminated. For instance, in Argentina, less than 5% of the population is being vaccinated. So we're not waiting for everyone who has a health passport or a COVID test each time he or she wants to go to the theater. It might be unsustainable for the audiences, and it might become an obstacle harder to resolve for us as theater managers or producers. So we are, I believe, in a stage that people has to be responsible as well, and we have to put some measures of safety and health precautions in place so everyone feels happy / responsible as well.
Makes sense.
So this is quite a big talking point in the UK at the moment, because I think there's a feeling that this might be a requirement when we go back to full capacity in June. So it's something that's been trailed by our Prime Minister Boris Johnson sort of a few weeks ago, as the idea that rapid testing might be the answer to opening things up. The problem that we have at the moment is that the lateral flow tests take 30 minutes, which I don't think is going to be practical to have 1,500 people queuing up outside a theatre for half an hour waiting for their tests. And I think in terms of the faster ones, there isn't the supply of them. And I think there are differing opinions about, even when we do get to those sort of 30-second, 1-minute tests, whether that's going to be practical. Might be somewhere like the West End, but I can't see regional theatres with large catchment areas where people have to drive 3 hours to get to the theatre. I just can't see that working. So I think that's quite a big debate in the UK at the moment. So it'd be interesting to see that. I think there is a chance that might be a requirement.
That's great. And Michael, Ginny, and Haruka, it's not something that has come up in your countries.
No,
it's not something that, certainly early on, as all of the different protocols and methods were being considered, it was one of the discussions, but not something that's required by the government authorities here.
But it does require us.
Rick, could you pop up that?
Yes, it does require us to have an open line of communication with the governments, because they do not know the nuts and bolts of producing or managing a theater. We have to explain them. So we have to find the right balance to keep safety, and at the same time find creative ways to rebuild our industry.
Britt, can you pop up the next question? Thank you. The question is, I'm curious if our panelists think that virtual or at-home components of theater are here to stay, or merely required temporary of COVID-19. This is from Alex at PRG.
Look, I think it's been interesting to see how we've been able to adapt in the theatre industry, and certainly move some of our activities online, and certainly share stories and excerpts and bits and pieces. I think certainly that's kept us all engaged and motivated. I would hope that, certainly once we're all back on deck, certainly the in-theatre experience becomes the primary focus. But I think it will be here to stay, and I think kind of the opportunity for us all is to work out how we continue to exploit our opportunities online while still preserving the theatre experiences for our performers and indeed for our audiences.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to add my 2 cents on this. I do believe in that. We know in Argentina have been discussing whether that was theater or not, the online streaming experiences. But I guess it's more of a discussion between ourselves and with the larger audience. I do believe that, so it's difficult to foresee in the long run, but right now, streaming performances might help us to get in touch with older audiences who are unwilling or unable to go to the theater, and yet they can experience a reformulated experience, even though at home, or because of financial obstacles, people may not be able to travel. Domestic tourism is being very weak as well. So, and also, if we have a limited capacity, it might help us get additional revenue, which is interesting as an additional window to maximize revenue. So, should it stay in the long run? We don't know, but we do have maybe those type of audiences. We might be able to enlarge our audiences as well. Of course, it's not the same as a live performance because our offering has a social component that we're missing, and that it's very difficult to enjoy at its full capacity. So instead of looking at the streaming services or the streaming performances as a competition, I believe that so far right now, it might be an additional window of opportunity for us to explore, maybe get more revenue, or get in touch with those segments of the audiences that are unwilling or unable to come.
Right.
Yeah, that's exactly how.
Almost.
Oh, so sorry.
No,
I was just going to say that's exactly how Shiki perceives the online virtual methods as well. We've tried out some live streaming of some of our original productions during this pandemic, and it, like Ariel said, it has brought us some extra revenue, which has obviously been helpful and brought us new fans as well. So they will be here to stay for a certain period of time, I think, but we believe that theater as an art form will just never be complete without audience and communication with our audiences. So, the live theater, in-theater experience will never be replaced, that's for sure.
We are almost at time, and I want to end on a hopeful note. And I'm wondering if you could tell us, anybody who's willing to offer one, an anecdote from the past year or something that makes you hopeful for the future of theater. Could be something you witnessed or something you heard about, whatever comes to mind for you when I say that.
I have one that springs to mind, which is I remember speaking to Anika Burns, who runs 6 West End theatres and was one of the first people to reopen in October. In the West End, one of the first people to reopen. And I remember her saying to me the volume of letters that she had from audience members saying how happy they were to be back in a theatre. And she was almost in tears. She was so overwhelmed kind of remembering this. So there was definitely a huge appetite from those people who love theatre out there, and I think on some levels reopening for a lot of people was a bit of a disaster last year, but in terms of seeing the joy that it brought to audiences, I think that balanced that in some ways.
It's beautiful. Thank you.
No, I think over the last year in Korea, we struggle to sell tickets as a producers, because like people were so afraid of going into these public spaces with so many other strangers. Then like now, because government kind of eased the restriction, as well as the audience kind of feel that theater is a safe place now. We have like shows that's being sold out completely for the entire run and things like that. So hearing those news, that makes me feel like, oh, it's very hopeful this year we will be able to make it. So that's the story that I just want to share with everyone to feel a bit more hopeful and confident about what we are doing.
No, I was just going to add, sitting in, having been fortunate to go to a few other productions over the past couple of months, but last week to see our company come together and to sit in the stalls, it was surprising. I didn't quite realize how emotional and overwhelming it would be. And I think we've all spent so long, it seems like an incredibly long time, having talked about the options of getting our shows open, and obviously, the heartbreak in closing shows down and trying to work through the A to Z of options of how do we reopen. But to be back in the theatre and to be seeing, colleagues, cast, crew doing what they do best, and then also to see these audience members. And, for us last week, we had audience members that had purchased their tickets 18 months ago. So it'd been a long time coming for them to be returning to a theatre, and just to see the joy, the excitement, for many of these people, particularly in Victoria opening last week, they've been in a hard lockdown for an extended period of time. So to see the community gather and engage once again, and for it to feel, albeit with masks and hand sanitizer and QR codes, for it to feel normal was just extremely exciting. And I, just say to everybody who is watching, who is waiting for their theatres to return, when it does, it's going to feel very, very special. And I can assure you that from our own little spot here in Australia, theatre will be returning back to normal, and it will feel very special, as it's always been.
Yeah, totally. I personally couldn't pinpoint just one moment, but all the moments that I could think of were moments like the one that Michael just described. And I think all the moments I thought of have something in common, and that is the fact that this pandemic has somehow brought all of us closer together as a community, both producers, audiences, cast, actors, technical crew, just everyone in this whole industry, I feel like have a whole new, renewed appreciation for theater itself, first of all. And on every single level, I felt like everyone is just, like you could tell how much you love theater and how everyone is doing it because they love it so much. And I mean, at least for my theater company, we have never been in more frequent communication with our international colleagues since this pandemic started. And, we also are in closer touch with our audiences, and just watching them complying with all these crazy protocols and still really giving us this huge applause at the end of the show is so moving. And it's all comforting to know that we are all in the same boat together. And so, like Michael said, theater will be back. It has endured plagues before. It's endured wars, natural disasters, and it's still here. And so we're definitely going to be back very soon. And when we do, I'm hopeful that we're going to be closer than ever, just as a bigger family, I think.
Amazing. Ariel, is there anything you want to add briefly before we close?
Yes, before each performance, when we receive our audiences, we have a welcoming message that we put by audio that finishes in every show before it starts the show with a phrase, "With you, it is much better," and people start cheering and applauding before the show opens, before each performance. So we know we got them there at the right feeling and moment, and it gets so exciting every time to see how people are happy, even without knowing what the show is about or the play, because we have so many original material right now on stage. But it's becoming, I think we're recovering and getting maybe one audience member at a time, but it's growing and it's getting there. So I feel confident. Yes, it might require to find consensus between all the stakeholders in our industry. But if we realize that we have a common goal, well, it will be the best of people at these times, and I'm confident that we will get there.
Thank you. It is so inspiring to hear those and so heartwarming. And I know all of us across the world are very jealous and can't wait to get to the moments that that you are talking about. So I want to thank everybody for coming today and our incredible panelists for all that you shared. As a reminder to folks watching, please fill out the survey link in the chat if you'd like to be on our mailing list for future panels. You'll also find our contact information in that survey in case you'd like to suggest future panel topics or have feedback about how we can provide the best possible resource for you and your community. And feel free to share this conversation with any friends or family that you think could benefit from it. The recording will live here on this platform. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you all hopefully in the theater.